Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of the Decoding Cocktails podcast. Today, I kind of pushed everything back a couple of weeks because there was a development last week, and while oftentimes I'm presenting on maybe more longer trend things or just other things that are points of interest, a current events issue came up in the past week that felt important to cover, and this will kind of be, I've got some notes here. It's going to be a little bit wandering. It's going to be just me. But the purpose behind today's episode is there is a group out there called Tequila Matchmaker. Certainly has been discussed multiple times on the podcast. And it's a couple, Grover and Scarlet. And they've been big fans of agave for a long time. And around 2015 or so, they began kind of cataloging all sorts of different tequilas. Part of what led to this, their own interest in it, but as one of the things that Tequila Matchmaker has become known for is this idea behind additive-free tequilas. So at one point in time, there was an estimate that roughly 70% of tequilas have additives in it. So we're going to back up and then we'll keep going from here. So to make sure we're all on the same page, tequila is a subset of mezcal. Now, as a former podcast guest, Alex Jandernoa once said, mezcal has something that it means both governmentally and culturally. So for a long time, basically all agave distillates were kind of more generally called mezcales, if you will. But in 1974, based on some interest out of a handful of parties, often like larger farming business types, tequila was created as a formal designation, just like you would think of champagne, for example. And so in 1974, 5 states in Mexico were approved to make what is now called tequila, using the Blue Weber agave plant. Now, the first thing that I always think is important to know laying this ground game is that for many of us, our introduction to tequila many years ago was with cheap product, and a lot of times this is what is known as mixto. And mixto is tequila that has been prepared with at least 51% agave, but the other 49% of the mash that we use to ferment and distill a product can be all sorts of things. And so often this is a cheaper tequila. But in more recent years, as the caliber of things has gone up, we have this whole other category of 100% blue agave tequila. And so in that vein, basically if a bottle does not explicitly say 100% agave, then it is a mixto. But another thing that's interesting is, so there is the, and I don't have their full name on hand, but when here in the U.S., tequila would be in part regulated by the TTB, is our government agency that oversees things. In Mexico, it is called the CRT. And so as part of the regulations of the CRT overseeing things, there is basically a stipulation in there that says that up to 1% of that 100% blue agave, so 1% of the total volume, can be one of 5 additives. And I don't have the list in front of me of all things right now, but there's various types of sugars, vanilla, oak extracts, glycerin, which is really going to kind of help to smooth things out. And I think one other thing that I am forgetting. But those can be added in that up to 1% of the total volume amount without having to be listed on the label. And we think about this in food a lot. What is in our food? And the first thing you need to know is interesting is at times we're talking about very little amounts of these additives going into tequila. as industry gets better at what it is, sometimes I saw Scarlet and Grover once do an exercise where they would really put in like a drop or two of this oak extract into, let's say, 12, 15 ounces of unaged tequila. And they said they felt like that drop or two could probably fool a large percentage of people into thinking that tequila had been oak aged. Now, the first thing that's important to say here is this doesn't mean that all tequilas out there that say 100% blue agave aren't good, or that they're all, that they're taking too many shortcuts. It's more, why are we putting these things in the first place? And so what Tequila Matchmaker really sought to do at a point in time was to really kind of begin to shine a light on what tequilas do we know that are out there are free of additives. Once you, the consumer, know what you're drinking, if you even care, please feel free to do it. But we feel like you should know. And so Scarlet and Grover created a program where people could voluntarily enroll their tequilas in this kind of audit to speak to the integrity of a product. And so they've been certifying tequilas as additive-free for a while. What's important to know is that, and this is kind of a broader problem, so we're going to talk about why additives aren't the end-all be-all too. But with the rise in demand for agave production, and naturally industry at times is trying to figure out how does it make more money. That's part of what business is often about. And so in that vein, at times, we want the perception of a very sippable tequila. So if we put a little bit of glycerin in there or a little bit of sugar, that's really going to help kind of smooth things out a little bit more. If we don't want to let our tequila age for as long because we need to get it out, we could put a drop of oak extract in there, or maybe a dash of vanilla in there. These are going to impart some of those flavors. And so what has begun to happen, and I'm going to speak to this anecdotally as well as kind of in a macro standpoint, is we're beginning to see consumers liking the idea of an additive-free tequila. And again, we'll talk about the ups and downs of this in a minute. But for example, last year, in the final couple of months of the year, I saw this reported by a guy out there. So this is by a tequila expert. I haven't verified this. Let's just say that these are roughly true. But in a 3-month or so period last year, he said that sales of Casamigo year over year were down by 9%, and Don Julio was down by 14%. And part of the reason is these are not certified as additive free. And part of this is because it's likely that in order to have a very consistent product, and perhaps because they want to go faster, these products are likely using additives in them. So to that vein, there's a retailer here in the greater St. Louis area, the wine and cheese place, that has really embraced this idea of the additive-free movement. And so they have taken Tequila Matchmaker's certifications, and they have gone ahead and put those stickers next to all the bottles in their store that are additive free. This has very, very quickly and very dramatically shaped how sales of these things are really playing out in a dramatic way. And so they've really begun to see that things are really shifting. So anyways, along those lines, this same retailer, the wine and cheese place, has said that similarly, whether it's Casamigos or whatever, the brands that suddenly don't have those stickers next to them, the sales of them are really beginning to plummet dramatically. So they've seen that in that level. On another time, in a similar vein, there's a distributor in the greater St. Louis area called Vintegrity. They kind of cover most of the state of Missouri. And one of their reps told me, so their agave portfolio, their tequila portfolio is entirely additive free at this point. And so to the stats along the lines of what the big brands are dropping, they, carrying all these additive-free tequilas, their portfolio was up roughly 35 to 40% year over year because of this. So very quickly, what we're beginning to see is that this is really having an impact on the numbers that are moving. Tom at the wine and cheese place said to me, they have a very basic affordable Additive-Free Tequila, Arete is the Arete, however you want to pronounce that. And for people who are coming in for the first time, they'll taste them on this. Super affordable, but additive-free. And Tom says that we always see to a T what they call this eye pop, where people try good tequila for the first time and they go, oh my God, this is so good. So as I was kind of doing my homework, studying and getting ready for this, I spoke with another retailer who spoke to me on the condition of anonymity that said, despite the fact that we're really interested in additive-free tequila, one of the things you're really never going to hear us do is stand up and make too big of a fuss about this publicly, because at times some of the distributors or some of the brands that we are supporting in this additive-free movement are tied to other bigger corporate products. And at times, industry has been known to withhold things. So along those lines, the journalist Emma Jansen, who has written extensively about agave, she's an amazing source on it. We'll link out to Emma's profile, said that a lot of smaller brands, as well, as they've begun to kind of feel this tension beginning to rise as the popularity of some of these things is increasing, how you talk about this is becoming dicey. So all that said, I kind of have circuitously made my way to why are we even having this conversation in the first place? So as Tequila Matchmaker has continued to evolve, they've created now what they're calling the Additive Free Alliance, and have even been offering like their own certifications or stickers, etc. This is where Mexico's government has started to, the CRT has started to kind of really push back on things. So what power Scarlet and Grover have to actually certify things on the bottle, we can discuss that. But anyways, they had begun to receive warnings from the Mexican government saying, hey, you're doing this in an unauthorized way. Now, everything's aftermarket, so I would argue they can do whatever the heck they want, but that's just me. Anyways, but with the big brands and the power dynamics starting to be upset in this regard, last week, the Mexico's Attorney General and a SWAT team or whatever the heck it is raided Tequila Matchmaker's offices and confiscated all their equipment. So as of now, the first people through the wall, if you will, have been bloodied. And yet, it's because, I would argue, as most people would, that's because that they are highlighting practices that at least, I don't think these things, that these additives are nefarious. I think what it is we are talking about ultra premium qualities or whatever. So there is, for example, I'll avoid smearing just because some of this I'm hearing secondhand right here, but there's a very ornate high-end bottle out there. And it's really developed an image as that of something really of high esteem. Anyways, and so last I checked, a Reposado bottle of this retails for around $170 here in the St. Louis market. And someone who is very deep in the agave industry said to me, yeah, he goes, there's a little bit of an aftertaste in that, and that is a signal for me that they're putting vanillin into there, so a vanilla-like extract into there. So these are the things where you're paying $170 for the pleasure of holding this beautiful bottle, and what industry doesn't want you to know is that they are tampering that to make it taste better. Again, if you know that and you don't care, that's totally fine. But so this is where we're really getting into this whole sticky situation right now of likely it being, whether or not this is happening directly or not, that the powers that be, big tequila, is really pushing back. And so all this is really likely going to do is to shine more light on the additive-free movement, because it looks like a cover-up now, unfortunately, for Scarlet and Grover. This is obviously a very, very painful thing. So a couple of things I want to talk about. An additive-free tequila, I think, is a great concept. But, and I'll link out to it, there's a Vine Pair article where a guy whose name I'm forgetting right now was quoted, but he just said the one thing for him about the additive-free movements that he doesn't love is he feels like it distracts from other things. So in the book Agave Spirits, for example, by David Suro, and as this gentleman said in this article, one, just because you're making an additive-free tequila doesn't mean you're doing all the right things ethically or morally, right? You could have an additive-free tequila and still be a jerk of a company, right? Still exploit your workers. We still have big issues with tequila and a lot of agriculture in general surrounding biodiversity and monocultures. Tequila is all this blue Weber agave plant. And there are ways to get into subsects of that, but how do we ensure that we are being environmentally sustainable? How are we practicing good water and food security? Wealth creation was a big thing. I'll link out to a conversation I had with the folks at Banez Mezcal. How do we make sure, especially in the era of celebrity tequila, how much of this money that is being made off of this heritage Mexican product is being made by Mexican people as opposed to by corporations or celebrities that just want to get their take right here? So additives are important, but they are not the only thing that matters in this product that is deeply saturated in Mexican culture. So before this all took off, one of the things I'd been thinking about quite a bit as well is what's the chance that as we begin to ask about additives in our tequila, we'll start to ask, are there additives in my bourbon or are there additives in my gin? And I remember another former podcast guest, Nicholas Palazzi of PM Spirits, saying at one point in time, do you know how hard it is to find Calvados, French apple brandy, without additives in it? So I think this conversation that Grover and Scarlet have started really stands to snowball into other categories in terms of what are we really drinking. Some of the legal restrictions on some of these categories might be so tight that there is nothing going into them. But on some of them, it's going to be a lot more murky. So I think that will be an important thing to know. So that is kind of what I have right there. One of the things that Martin Lodvigs, another guy I had on the podcast from IWSR, the data company, said that he talked about in our conversation, brands in many degrees of facets of the food and drink world have begun as consumers have wanted a greater health and wellness aspect to what they are consuming. They've begun to kind of go in and clean up those brand recipes a little bit more. And Martin and I even talked directly about the Tequila Matchmaker thing. It's like you could wait for the Mexican government to tell you can't put these products in here, but then you've got a Grover and Scarlet coming along, not asking permission, but suddenly shining a transparent light on what is happening in the industry. So I will also, if you're interested or have really benefited from the additive-free movement, there are on Tequila Matchmaker's website, there is a Scarlet and Grover started accepting donations. This was before this raid right here, but I know that a number of people have been contributing as well to that. So one, we'll be sure to link out to their page, how to donate and whatnot, and something to just consider in terms of, despite the elevation of some of these things, there are powerful interests in play who want to protect the status quo. So there you go. That's a little important detour this week. We'll be back with our standard conversations for the following episode. But thanks for listening, everybody, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. The show notes for today's episode are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. If you'd like to keep up with what we're working on, there are two great ways to do so. One, our short weekly newsletter, Cocktail Confidential, which you can sign up for at decodingcocktails.com/newsletter, or give us a follow on Instagram at Decoding Cocktails. If you think this podcast is great stuff, we'd love it if you'd subscribe or, of course, share an episode with a friend. The Decoding Cocktails podcast is produced by Chris Bay and myself. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon, and happy cocktailing.